as all of us have lived through the last 18 months, the sort of crisis that we've had to deal with of an unprecedented magnitude. If someone had told us that we would have to live through the times that we've lived through in the last 18 months, you would have said that's really poor science fiction. It wasn't even making sense in science fiction, but it turned out to be real. And the impact of what we've dealt with, what we are dealing with, the crisis, the pandemic, the way it's changed our lives, the way it's changing our lives, the way we work, the way we earn, the way we interact in society, the way we socialize, all of that has undergone such an upheaval that it's very difficult to put all of this in a pigeonhole, a definite pigeonhole, and say, this is how life will unfold from here on. It's going to be an evolving change. It's going to be perhaps, it'll take half a generation, perhaps, as the world, as a society, as a people, to come to grips with the kind of subliminal and overt changes that this experience, this phase would have instilled in all of us. Therefore, it becomes very important to listen to critical minds who have observed, who have tried to assess what is happening, who have the ability also to look a little bit into the future to see how, where the changes could be and how the changes will play out. Therefore, in Professor Rajan, we've got a perfect person to engage with this evening. I want to start off this conversation really with something that's on the top of everybody's minds, and that's the whole vaccination program, which started rolling out in the world about 7-8 months back. It seemed to be the only solution to the crisis that we've had to live through. Therefore, and Professor Rajan has written about it. He's obviously, I'm sure, observed the different vaccination programs and models that the world has adopted. Through trial and error, we seem to be stumbling our way towards an effective workable model. So my first question to him is, how does he assess the vaccination program in the world so far? Does he believe this is the magic bullet which will get us to neutralize this crisis? Is there a difference between the developed world and the developing world? Is there a better paradigm of vaccinations which can help us return to a near normal position? So, Professor Rajan, if you could take us through that first.
Yeah, well, let me preface this by saying I'm not an epidemiologist, and I sort of have absorbed as much as everyone has, given our need to do this. I mean, the reality is that it's a very unequal vaccination program in the world, both across countries and within countries, right? The countries that were savvy, that had effective governments, went about procuring the vaccines early, most effective being Israel, which didn't actually manufacture any of it, but procured it very early on. It's a small country. And they went about vaccinating everybody. The problem, of course, is the virus morphs. And so what worked against the first versions, the first variants, is less effective against later variants. So it's not, it turns out, just a question of vaccinating everybody you can as early as possible. You also have to worry about booster doses. That's something the United States is thinking about now, having vaccinated most of the people who are willing. Now, what are the problems that we see across the countries? The first and most immediate problem is the lack of vaccines, right? You see this hugely in Africa, but you've also seen it in India, the absence of procurement. We could have done more, we didn't. The second is the rollout itself, which you pointed to. Some of the countries in Africa have received vaccines, but rolling it out has been quite difficult because of the lack of logistics. I think we've done a better job, certainly in India, than some of those countries, given our facilities. The third is overcoming vaccine hesitancy and all the fake news surrounding vaccines. And that's a job even in the industrial countries. In the US, so many states are hugely under-vaccinated, and they're experiencing a much stronger flow of the Delta virus precisely because people are rejecting the vaccines for a variety of sources of misinformation. The Trumpistas are doing it for one reason, and the African American population is doing it sometimes because they've had a historical suspicion of government programs on the medical front. So I think you need to overcome all this, but even then you're not done because the virus keeps changing. What is sorely lacking, I would argue the biggest thing that's lacking in the world is a sense of global leadership on this. There is so much need. So much could be produced with so little investment if there was much more of a global sense that we need to do this fast and no one is safe until everyone is safe. That hasn't permeated. Countries still think that they can become safe on their own without ensuring that the broader public is safe. So a lot needs to be done. We are seeing various governments looking good at some point, looking bad at other points. This is not a virus which is which boosts government egos. It tends to deflate them, and I think that's pretty clear across the world.
Any quick couple of changes that you think need to be brought in? You've talked about the need for a massive campaign and leadership. I mean, I think the word you used is that there needs to be a much greater sense of global ownership and leadership. But any tweaks to the kind of models that we are seeing?
I think the biggest need right now is more vaccines. I mean, that's so deficient. Unless you fix that, everything else is second order to some extent. I mean, some countries in Africa at 1% and 2% vaccination, and they're seeing the Delta virus come in a big way. Of course, in India, we've vaccinated about 12% fully, maybe 40% of the relevant population in one dose. But we need to do it faster, given the possibilities of third and fourth waves. So yes. I would say we need to produce more and roll it out as quickly as possible. Everything else is second order. For us, vaccine hesitancy at this point is second order because we don't have enough vaccines.
Would you have, and this is my last question on the vaccine before we move on to other things. Would you advocate that this could have, all the vaccines in the world could have gone on a universal license? And then that could have been put, the production facilities could have worked much more, and much more vaccine would have been produced instead of keeping these narrow IPR regimes alive?
I think that's a possibility, but I don't think the issue is cost, right? I mean, if you were to pay these vaccine producers even the margins that they want, it is relatively small compared to the enormous amounts we're spending on dealing with the consequences of the virus, right? So we're spending trillions there, maybe tens of billions if you bought out all the sort of patents by giving them a fair price.
Yes.
The issue is more trying to incentivize them to build those factories in record time, providing them the resources, and essentially buying what they would produce for the next few years so that they don't have worries about demand. Many of them worry, I set up my factories, I gear up to producing billions of vaccines, and then boom, there's a day when it stops because we've sort of dealt with it. And then what do I do with these factories? I mean, those are some of the private sector concerns. Now, if you came together and said, we need so many vaccines as the world, and we're willing to pay for African vaccinations, we're willing to pay for poor country vaccinations, and you set that up, I think you could, double or triple. Of course, the private sector is gearing up, has been gearing up, but it could have been done far more effectively with government support and multilateral, consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I caught one sentence that you said, and it always boggled my mind that an RT-PCR test costs 3x or 4x a vaccine. And there has been so much effort and resource going into an RT-PCR test as opposed to a vaccine, which, as you said, we really should have. I mean, wisdom of hindsight, but I guess that's really the critical thing. I want to pick up on another thing that you've written about. Very interestingly, you've said that inequality in the Western world has come down, in the developed world has come down because of the pandemic, which possibly is one of the few positive outcomes of this crisis. But the collateral is that inequality within poorer countries, including India, has gone up, and inequality between richer and poorer countries has gone up. And you've talked about a fear that this could lead to radicalization and street protests. Put that all in perspective for us.
Well, first, the tremendous amount of support in industrial countries, and of course, an outlier here is the United States, has to some extent cushioned the blow. But even more than that, I mean, the evidence is some of the poorer segments of the population, because of the transfers that have been made to them, including unemployment insurance, which actually paid more than their jobs, and has allowed them to, because partly they weren't spending also during this period, has allowed many of them to pay down their debts. So, some of them were living payday to payday on, huge payday loans, on credit card loans, and so on. And what this has helped them do is pay down some of their debt. And so as a result, some of the poorer segments of population, I'm not saying this tragedy has been any better for them. Many of them have been frontline workers, forced to go out and work at this time. But it has also, because of this enormous size of the transfers, helped them sort of effectively improve their financial situation. I mean, just one thought would make this clear to our audience, that in fact, the incomes of Americans during some of the quarters of this pandemic has been higher than their incomes before, because of the transfers that were made. So that's on the side of the industrial countries: less consumption, more income, which means more savings, and that has permeated down to the lower and middle income segments of the population. In the poorer countries, because there haven't been these transfers, what we've seen instead is the lower middle incomes have slipped into poverty. In India, you can see consumption, especially of the poorer households, has become more restricted during this pandemic. And that's a huge worry, because you take the longer term damage that is also done. The poorer kids have no access to online devices, maybe a phone if they're lucky. And imagine the quality of lessons they've had over this year and a half. And the problem is not just, they're not keeping up, they're forgetting. Kids forget. And so if you've been out of school for a year and a half, you're probably 3 years behind at the time you go back. I really hope that our state governments and our central government is thinking very, very hard about how to bring these kids back to school, especially the poorer segments. Otherwise, we've lost generations of kids. I mean, this is not a small thing in the life of a country. You said, right, looking forward, what is going to happen? Well, if these divides increase, I mean, think of kids who already had a pretty awful education because of the quality of the schools they went to, but now who are 3 or 4 years behind, and there's no remedial measure to bring them back to speed, back to the classes they're in. And so they fall further behind, they drop out. Think of, this whole generation of kids, 30-40% of them dropping out because they simply cannot cope. That's a disaster of a major scale. And we should be thinking about how to remedy this in a really big way. This is not a small thing. It's a huge issue for poorer countries. It's an issue in the US also, with all the gadgets and so on. Many kids don't have access to broadband. And so they've also suffered, but it's something they're thinking about. They're thinking about how to spend to make it better. We should be thinking about that also.
So that's, is it going to be essentially a resource allocation issue? Should we be looking at, putting much more money behind, and then of course, behind education and health, the two core sectors. And then of course, the whole issue about what do you do about deficit financing? Should we be printing money? These debates have been happening in India.
Yeah.
The government of India is seen to be very, very conservative fiscally. They've increased the fiscal deficit, but nowhere near what other countries have done. What's your sense?
Well, you have to spend where you have to spend. You have to be very careful because you don't have that much money, but you risk being penny wise and pound foolish on issues like education. If you have not brought these kids back up to speed in the classes they were in, and you just treat it as business as usual. The school's open, kids come back to the classes where they would have been otherwise, and nothing really changes. Well, you've got, as I said, a lost generation of kids. That lost generation is not going to go anywhere. It's going to be with you for the next 60 years. How do you deal with that? I mean, this is a mega societal problem, which we'd better not allow to fester, because it could haunt us for many, many decades to come. So on
this debate about resource raising, the government of India is still going pretty fiscally conservative. Would you be on the side which says that they need to loosen the purse strings, maybe even monetize the deficit? These debates have been happening for a year in this country.
Well, I mean, I think we've already monetized the deficit. So we're beyond that. I mean, think about how much the RBI's balance sheet has grown. So that's not the issue. The issue is, our debt to GDP is going to hit 90% sometime over the course of this year or the next. That's a big number, but it's a number that many other countries in the developed world have reached. Developing world, less so. We're a little bit of an outlier along with Brazil. But if we can spend effectively, but also be much more innovative in raising resources. We've talked about privatization for a long time. Well, when is that going to see the light of day? This is where the political establishment has to push much harder, because I don't see any will in the bureaucrats to privatize in an effective way, or sell some of the excess resources the government has, like land. Can we do transparent auctions of land? But we need to raise those resources for the spending that is absolutely essential. Otherwise, we'll scar the economy even more than it is already scarred. And that is going to hold back our potential growth for, as I said, decades to come. So we have to spend carefully. I'm not saying, let's throw the books out of the window. I think the government was right in coming clean on the deficit during the last budget. Being transparent is a good thing. But I also think we have to spend on the things that need spending. And that means being careful, but it also means not holding on, for the sake of some sort of mythical rating agency. They would prefer it if you spent on the things that enabled your growth, enabled long-term potential. And I think we need to think about that very carefully. And certainly having the poorer segments of our society becoming incapable of contributing is not where we want to be.
Yeah, so, you've also, the sort of other side of this coin is that you've also spoken of the fears and the concerns that come with a two-paced global recovery. I'm paraphrasing what you've written, two-paced global recovery, which we're already seeing with the pressures on the interest rates in the West. The US Treasury, which had gone for the first time ever gone down below 100 basis points into 50 basis points, is now back at about 130, 140 basis points. So with those pressures on global interest rates, what happens to countries like ours, which already are running such huge debts, pretty high deficit, and the interest rates are rising? Now, that could be a dislocation for the economy.
Absolutely. Which is why we need to not throw the rule books out of the window. We have to worry about the deficit, but we have to worry about it in a sensible way. That means really the premium on effective government goes up. We need to be much more effective, and we need to be very clear about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So one example, even in this environment of rising potential interest rates, of the Fed sort of drawing back on the stimulus, and the potential for capital to go back as it did during the taper tantrum, there is a potential. But you can look good amongst this by sort of laying out a path which suggests that you are going to bring back growth, you are going to have a stable polity going forward, you're going to do the right things, right? And that means looking good on a number of dimensions. For instance, I thought the settling of some of those cases, the tax cases, was a good one, because we had gone through all the arbitration, etc., and it was going nowhere. We were looking really an outlier. So I thought it was high time it was settled. I thought the initial sort of idea was a bad one, but now that we were there, it was good that we settled. Second, I think that China is doing a lot to harm its own private sector. For some good reasons, for some not so good reasons. We can come to that later. But I think in that environment, India, if it obeys the rule of law, looks a lot better. Now, for that, we have some strengths. We have a judiciary which works and which is not necessarily under the thumb of the government. And so what we should do is emphasize that as a difference and say there is protection for the private sector here. We don't do it arbitrarily based on the needs of the government. And we should emphasize that and actually make that much clearer in all the things we do. So I think there are ways we can differentiate ourselves and make sure that capital sort of sees us as a safe haven, even when the Fed is raising interest rates, so it doesn't flow out all the same. People are looking for an alternative to China. We always were the alternative until we started sort of collapsing in growth. If we can revive the potential for that growth, but also emphasize our private sector credentials and the constraints on the government. Unbridled government is problematic for investment. And so if we can say the government is constrained, is going to respect the rule of law, we have a much better chance to keep the capital we've attracted, in fact, attract more.
So I'm going to come now to one more issue, which ties up quite a few of the things that we've already spoken about. The fact that, there's going to be a two-paced global recovery, the fact that inequality has gone up within poorer countries. What we are seeing in India is a much larger formalization of the economy, where the organized corporate sector seems to be virtually colonizing sector after a sector. I'm deliberately using a stronger word, colonizing, because it happened a bit in demonetization. We saw the beginning of that in demonetization. But with the pandemic, what we've seen is that the informal sector has virtually collapsed. The corporate sector, because of its very high digital abilities, has been able to stay afloat and has virtually picked up market share from the informal sector. So now what we are seeing is a massive formalization. Corporate profits have gone up dramatically, but the informal sector is in pain. Now, on a normal day, formalization of the economy is a good thing, but in an abnormal situation like we are going through, how good is it? And is there need to calibrate that?
Well, you hit on a very important issue, right? If you look at the stock market in India, people would ask, what pandemic? There's nothing. And the reality is that's the tip of the iceberg, and it's a very well-to-do tip of the iceberg. If you look at upper skilled services, many people have been able to work from home. Their incomes are assured. There's really no problem there, and that's the formal tip. That is the consultants, the lawyers, the investment bankers, and so on. And that's very healthy right now. The problem is what lies beneath. And so many people in the informal sector have had very precarious jobs. Lockdowns have hurt them, their ability to work. You can see gold loans go up. Gold loans going up is a concern because our households don't part with their gold until they're in dire straits. You see these consumption surveys. Consumption has fallen, and of food, and that's another worry. If you look at unemployment, basically. From 39.5% of the workforce being employed, we've gone down to 36.5%. That's 3% of the employment to population ratio has fallen by 3%. That's a huge number. If you think of the number of people involved, it's many millions. So this is something we have to pay attention to because you can see that this is longer term, this will affect demand. What you're seeing initially is the higher level discretionary demand has sort of still stayed firm. Four-wheeler, demand for cars. Look at two-wheeler demand. that has not been as healthy. Look at the bottom of the rung two-wheelers, the kind of stuff that entry-level people buy. That's fallen really tremendously. That's suggesting inequality within the country has increased. Now, formalization broadly is a good thing if you allow the informal sector an easy way to become formal. Right. But if the informal sector survives because of its informality, and as soon as they start paying the taxes, etc., they simply cannot survive. Then what you've done is you force them to formalize at the worst time. Yeah, longer term, this makes sense. But forcing them to formalize when the whole economy is being hit means basically they close down. And the extent of damage in the SMEs, I mean, we've had a whole bunch of moratoria. We simply do not know. When we reopen, we will find the true extent of damage, how much, how many of these can pay, how many will sort of sit on land and machinery, which they simply cannot use because they have no access to working capital. So I think we need to think more carefully about what's underneath that tip of the iceberg and focus on what that needs to come back when the economy comes back. Now, don't be deceived by a rebound. You go down a lot, you're going to rebound just because people come back to the office, come back to work, etc. That rebound looks spectacular because we went down spectacularly. It looks like, it's, this year we're going to go 10%. Wonderful. When did we ever grow 10%? But we went down to 8.5% or 9% last year, or, the 7% according to the official statistics. So the question is, going forward, are we going to get back to that 6.5% growth? What do we need to do that? If you've got a large segment of the population without jobs, dipping into poverty, with their kids not learning, I mean, that's not a recipe for strong growth. You can talk a lot about the formal corporate sector, but it's the rest that is also needed in order to supply the demand for that formal corporate sector. That's not going to come back easily.
So two quick thoughts there. One, of course, just a tangential thought to what you said. Whenever people talk about growth rates, I personally believe that financial year 2021 should be declared as a zero year, and all growth rates should be given, annualized growth rate should be given with reference to the 1920 financial year. Because otherwise, people are spinning statistics all around us. Exports have gone up 50% from a collapsed quarter one last year. So what are we talking about? So I think that's just a tangential point. I think the world needs to think that through. But coming back to what you said about protecting, there is a need today to protect the informal sector, maybe as a temporary measure, because otherwise you do need the informal sector to become formal in a genuinely healthy economy. So what kind of safety nets should be created now?
So I would do a two-pronged thing. One, make it easier for the informal to become formal. That's the reform we've been talking about so long, right? Doing business reforms. Now, this is a little bit of a sham because doing business, we sort of target the World Bank's assessment of these things, which means what the World Bank wants to hear rather than the true ease of doing business on the ground. What I would say is, if we can really ease doing business on the ground, that would be a huge positive for our informal sector, making it easy for them to become formal. And perhaps one can think of ways in which costs of doing business sort of ramp up as you become much more formal, and they're lower initially without the kind of, I mean, if you make it too abrupt, then people want to stay small forever. Below 10 employees, for example, because the costs of formalization were much, much higher. You don't want to do that, but maybe some benefits as you start small and some positive benefits as you grow larger would be a good thing. So that requires rethinking our regulatory structures somewhat. The second is many of these entities are, have borrowed. Many of them, some of them have benefited from the government sort of loans to guarantees to SMEs. But I think we need to think about the level of indebtedness of this sector and try and find ways that we can have easy ways for them to renegotiate their debts with the landlords, with the not the formal debt tribunal, but more informal sort of negotiating structures that you set up many of these so that with maybe a retired judge, and they can come together, they can very quickly settle what is reasonable and go away with the imprint of a quasi-judicial structure on it, because there's going to be a lot of debt overhang once we actually require these firms to pay, which currently they're not. So everything looks hunky-dory, but think of the damage that's built up over this time. So I would say, focus on debt restructuring as much as possible and try and push towards easing credit flows to these once the debt restructuring happens, because clearly in an attempt to come back, they need a lot of credit flows. So that all that will be useful, work on both sides, both helping the informal, but help them also become more formal in an easier way. Back to you. Sorry, I must.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, that you have to make it easier for them to survive. And survival is usually dependent upon, obviously, business coming back, but also your ability to maintain your liquidity, maintain your cash flows, maintain your ability to meet your obligations, working capital. All of that is terribly important. Otherwise, things just go belly up. I want to pivot to another related economic phenomenon to what we've talked about. And that is the increasing footprint of protectionism across the world. Now, this is not something which started with the pandemic. These forces were gathering pace even several years before the pandemic. But what the pandemic has done is that people have shrunk inwards. People have started looking inwards. Governments have started looking inwards, almost like hiding yourself, almost like, saving yourself from the blows. So therefore, protectionism has really accelerated through the pandemic, especially even in India, for instance, our duty structures and all, we've seen fairly significant change. What's your sense? Is this a good thing for the world? Is it a temporary thing that will necessarily, once the pandemic eases out, revert to the mean? Will we need to make special efforts to revert to the mean? Or has the scare of the pandemic thrown deep roots within countries, and therefore you could see far longer periods of protectionism? For instance, India is totally talking about Atmanirbhar now. There is so much talk of self-reliance, and within self-reliance, while self-reliance is a good word, some of the sub-code is very protectionist.
Right. So Raghav, I would club protectionism with also internal competition. These are two facets, both of which lead to greater competition. And I would say that one of the consequences of pandemic, what you just said, is the former larger corporations have in fact grown bigger. And in India, we also have a problem of competition. We have a few business houses which dominate relative to the rest and have gotten bigger over the course of the last so many years. So we have to be careful about that also. I'm not saying every big house is a problem, but I am saying that too little competition is a problem. And where there is too little competition, too close access to the government, the ability to change laws and rules according to what you think is best for your business, I think that becomes a problem for the country. So we have to be very careful both on domestic competition. Our competition commission has to be much, much stronger and more effective than it has been. I think for a while it was getting stronger. Now, to my mind, it has to look on it in its past and figure out what it has done wrong, because simply is not working as advertised. The second, I think, is this external competition, what you're talking about as protectionism. And they work together because the big internal people also see, let me keep the big external people out so that I don't have to face them domestically. And that creates even less of a competitive environment within the country. So I think we need to be careful about that. I would say that given the weakness of demand in developing countries, in emerging markets going forward because of the consequences of the pandemic, this is the worst time for us to push protectionism. We need external demand. We need to service the rest of the world. And the more protectionist we are, first, it hurts us. We do know that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. That's what economists keep saying. The public needs to realize that every time I increase the cost of the inputs to the stuff I export, it makes my export so much less competitive. And therefore, if I start taxing inputs, tax steel, put tariffs on steel, put tariffs on aluminum, I can't export cars. and I become cost uncompetitive. So it's extremely important to keep that notion in mind, because we need exports as a big factor in our growth going forward. This is the wrong time to kill it. But also, I would say we need to be much more clever. We keep thinking that the way to export Atmanirbhar is all about manufacturing. Be like China. I mean, that reflects a lack of what I would say creativity. I mean, we have other strengths. Why don't we think about exploiting those other strengths? We have doctors who speak English. Telemedicine took off during the pandemic. Can we find a way to offer telemedicine around the world without exporting our doctors? Let's keep our doctors domestically, but maybe they can have value-added work and don't need to emigrate. They can stay in India. And we can have many more doctors as a result. What does that require? That requires negotiating with the West. How do we get our doctors licensed there so that they can practice telemedicine? How do we get organizations? How do we store medical data? Do we store it there? Do we store it here? How can we make you trust that we will protect your medical data? This requires a lot more thinking if we want to export services. But if there's one thing the pandemic has told us, services can be done at a distance. So why don't we start pushing our strength in English, our strength in high quality services, which we already occupy a place in, but much more widely. And that requires thinking anew, not the old way. Yes, we're going to provide incentives for people to set up manufacturing, but let's think of other ways also. I'm not saying don't focus on manufacturing, but focus on everything else also.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And we need to be the evangelizer of a much bigger services, much more globalized service economy than we have. You're right. I mean, we've gone into this, let's start exporting iPhones to the world, which is, as you said, it's a good thing to do, but there are other things that we could focus on. I want to, don't want to just stick to the hard parts of the economy. You also focus quite a bit on climate action plan. And I want to talk about it because that's something which has come bang in the center of global consciousness. Again, somehow in the pandemic, we've got the IPCC report. We've also seen the kind of impact that climate change has had on, we've seen landslides, we've seen heat waves, we've seen forest fires. So I think now nobody doubts, except for maybe someone on the fringe, now nobody doubts that this is a big crisis that we need to deal with. You have advocated a payment plan, a taxation plan, an incentive plan, all rolled into one, which could reward some of the low emitters and put a tax or a penalty on the high emitters. Take us through that.
Well, first, I think I have to agree entirely with you. This is the problem of our times. We're seeing it emerge in front of us. And we, as a country, not that far from the equator, but with a very, dependent on the monsoon, are going to be so much more sort of susceptible to climate change in India. So it is in our interest to do something about it. But we need the developed world to stop sort of manufacturing their own sort of plans, which tend to be unfair with respect to us. Take, for example, they haven't been able to get global agreement. So how they're going about it is now effectively taxing the financing of any kind of brown investment in natural gas, in coal, and so on, by essentially telling their financial institutions, thou shalt not lend. I mean, they're not saying it so obviously, but they're putting huge penalties on any kind of investment in coal, in investment in natural gas, anything other than renewables. And, maybe this is the longer run way to go, but it privileges those who already have those and hurts those who have a growth pathway, which requires building some of this out. Again, maybe it is in the interest of the world to stop building coal plants. We certainly in India have done that for economic reasons. But I think it is best that this be done as a fair exchange. We stop building them. You already have them. You're not going to close them down for some time. But if you need to continue running them, pay for it. So what we need effectively is a global tax on carbon. And even this is saying, you America have put a lot of carbon in the air. You China are putting a lot more carbon in the air now. But we're going to let bygones be bygones. But for every additional per capita ton of carbon you put out, if you're above the global average, you pay. And that's based on incremental, what you're doing additionally. While you collect this money and give it to the countries who are putting out less than the average. Now, the beauty of this is both the countries below the average and the countries above the average face the same incentive. If I save on 1 ton of carbon per capita, I actually earn a certain amount of money. For the big sort of emitters, they have to contribute less to that common pool. For the low emitters, they get more from the common pool. So effectively, everybody has the same incentive. That doesn't mean you have to impose a carbon tax domestically. If you want to just raise, petrol prices, or you want to do something else, you feel free to do it. But know that every ton per capita of additional carbon you emit is going to cost you. So that global incentive structure to me seems fair. Fair because the low emitters get money, which they should, because they're not emitting. And the high emitters don't get a free pass because they're already emitting so much. And only the incremental is taxed. They have to pay for what they're already emitting.
Yeah, this also actually answers the question that you said, that let bygones be bygones. Actually, you're also paying for the bygone, right? You're paying for the fact that you've created that much of extra carbon.
Exactly.
And equalization.
Raghav, you're paying for the fact you've created carbon emitting capacity, but you're not paying for the carbon that you've already emitted and put into the atmosphere. So still is biased towards Western countries and Japan, but not as biased as the current system is, where they say, forget the past, forget even what we're emitting. Let's talk about additional investments you're going to make. And you who are going to thinking about investing in carbon, don't invest in natural, and maybe that's the right thing for us to do. But why should we forget the past? Why should we forget the present? And this is an attempt to say, now, do I think any of this will be implemented? No, but I think it's a conversation starter at the right place.
Yeah,
the problem in international negotiations is always we start where they want us to start, which is the wrong place for us, because it already assumes much of what they want us to assume. And the notion is to get a lot of developing countries behind such an idea because it's in their interests. And then if they start pushing, I think you will get more of a consensus which veers towards this rather than one which stays where they are. Now, I don't think the answer is no agreement. The answer is an agreement which is fairer, for which we have to work, because they're going to keep saying, oh, you're just sabotaging the agreement. No, we're trying to get agreement on something which is much fairer to us than what you've been proposing so far.
Yeah, and you're moving away from getting trapped in that, but this happened before. But you're not a prisoner of history. There is an element of equalization, as you said. There is an elasticity of equalization in what you're proposing, and it's a conversation starter. So it makes a lot of sense. We could go on and on, but I think we've got a few questions here that I would that I'm sure are more substantial than what I have been able to conjure. Let me just see whether we get some of these questions going. Well, Mudit Jain has a question which it's a question that has hung over all our minds. We've seen the spectacular numbers from China about the vaccination program. That they are doing 10 million. Of late, they were doing 15 million a day, and that they've gone ahead and vaccinated over 80-90% of the population. So Mudit's question is, do you believe these numbers? China continues to be a black box.
I think it's easy to keep questioning China's performance, and I think some questions are often warranted. But I think they've also delivered in many ways what they've claimed, right? I mean, look at their high-speed rail network, for example. I mean, humongous in how much they've done, how quickly. There may be some questions about quality and so on, but they do, when the government puts its mind to something, they manage to deliver reasonably effectively, especially if what can be delivered can be measured. So I wouldn't sniff at those numbers. With China, I would worry more about the dominance of the Communist Party and its unwillingness to allow the private sector, or let's put it this way, the absence of checks and balances. When the Communist Party says jump, everybody says how high. Right now, it's said jump to the private sector, and you've got the specter of many sort of private sector CEOs resigning rather than sort of having to face up to continuous monitoring and dialogue with the party. So that is damaging in the long run. I mean, if again, take the issue of services I talked about. Would you want to do services with a Chinese company when you know that the data that it collects on you, including your private medical services, can be shared with the government? In fact, must be shared with the government. How easy is it going to be for China to expand abroad with financial services, with medical services, with legal services, when everybody knows the long arm of the government is hanging over it? And my sense is this therefore gives an opportunity for other countries to say, we're not them. We actually have checks and balances on our government. We have a privacy law which protects private data and prevents government agencies from coming in without the writ of a high court judge, without the permission of a high court judge. I mean, these kinds of things will make us look a lot better in the global sort of evolution of services. So I would say, let's not dish China for the wrong things. When they want to do something, they do it very effectively. They have a very effective government when it puts its mind to it. The issue is, does it put its mind to the right things? Right. And perhaps there we can have a march over them.
Okay, so there's another question on a very, very hot button issue, and this comes from Kristen Almeida, who asks, what is your opinion on the vaccine passports and racial undertones and exclusions related to types of vaccines?
I'm sorry, I missed that. The vaccine what?
The vaccine passports.
Vaccine passports. Yeah.
Passports and the racial undertones and exclusions which are related to the types of vaccines. China saying only Chinese vaccines and America saying only American-approved vaccines and all of that.
This is where I think there's a total lack of global leadership and dialogue on this, right? I mean, we should have negotiated this at the global level. The G20 should set up a group to talk about this, and basically anything that has proven reasonably effective using whatever sort of verification structures they exist should be part of the passport, right? There should not be discrimination because AstraZeneca is or AstraZeneca made in Europe versus AstraZeneca made in India. I mean, this seems really part of the total collapse of global leadership on this issue. So, on the racial issues, I mean, there is a racial issue in the US in the sense that certain minorities are not getting vaccinated. But some of that is also related not so much to the availability of the vaccine, but to vaccine hesitancy. And some of that, again, stems from historical sort of bad experiences with government. And I think we need better communication to including from stalwarts in the community to push that kind of vaccination further.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's astonishing that, we are trying to divide this whole effort into narrow confines, saying that we will accept only people who are vaccinated in America, and England is now saying we'll only accept people who are vaccinated in our NHS. So if you've been vaccinated outside of our NHS, then you still have to go through the testing and all of that. And really, much more leadership needed here, as you say. I'm going to pivot to a completely different question, and this comes from anonymous attendee. So that's what the name is. Your views on digital currencies. Now, this is again very hot button issue, not much to do with the pandemic. And India's made a beginning, as I'm sure you're fully aware, with using digital vouchers. We've started the e-rupee, which is not a digital currency, but at least it's a digital voucher. and therefore could be a stepping stone towards a digital currency. What are your views on that?
First, I think you have to distinguish digital currencies from cryptocurrencies, right? Many cryptocurrencies are not really effective in payments. They're objects, tokens that you can hold for value. They go up and down, but as a means of payment, you really want something which is relatively stable and which is easy to transact. Bitcoin doesn't quite fit the bill there. As far as digital currencies go, there are variety. One is even your wallet that the number of companies offer in India, where you can load rupees onto it and then you can use it. That effectively is a digital currency because you can use it to pay for your transactions. What the number of countries are experimenting with now is in official digital currency. The Chinese are thinking of in e-yuan. They have certainly rolled out some projects on it. And the idea would be that it would be a digital currency that you can load again onto a wallet from your bank account, and you can use it to pay. Their concern is today Alipay and Tencent have 95% of the payment market for small retail payments. And they're very worried that two big companies doing it all, and they'd rather sort of displace those companies. And this is where the e-yuan comes in. Of course, longer term, they think a digital yuan or renminbi may be a competitor to the US dollar. I think we're still a long way from there. I put this way, and of course, there's a private sector equivalent, which is a stable coin. Things like Tether, things like DM, which Facebook is coming out with. Broadly speaking, any of these, essentially facilitate inclusion and payments. We already have something like this in India with UPI. You can make payments from your bank account to anybody else anytime, and you can also do it from your digital wallet to anybody else. So all these, I think, the initial sort of break of the bank monopoly on this is quite effective and valuable. After that, the returns become lower and lower because you've already got most of the gains. But I think digitalization of payments extremely important. India's made tremendous strides there. UPI was a immense advance, and we're building on that. Maybe the RBI eventually will come up with a central bank digital currency. I don't know what the plans on that are, but to my mind, we've gotten a long way with the digitalization of payments, including through UPI already, and that's been very effective so far.
So I'm going to wrap this up with the last question, and this one is it's way outside the boundary of what we've been talking, but in a sense it's within the boundary also, because you alluded to it. You alluded to how China has turned on its own big business, certainly the big digital business, its unicorns. And its consumer internet companies and its education tech companies and its data companies. The question comes from Bonaventure Step. And the question is, how about unicorns in India offering IPOs with bizarre valuations? I'm not putting any words. This is the question that has come. Is it a good thing for the small investors? You can link it to the China point that you said we will come back to.
Yeah, I don't have a view on valuations. I rarely give investment advice. If I knew as much, I'd be richer than Purnendu, which is a hard sell. Look, I really think that what is important now, the Chinese, to their credit, are saying that some of the reasons we're moving against big digital is because of monopoly practices, because they're non-transparent, they're not respecting the privacy of individuals and so on. That may all be important in this drive. The problem is there are no checks and balances on what one bureaucrat decides on what the private sector should do. I think this kind of video game is bad, so I ban it. Well, who am I to decide? I'm sitting in my room in North Block, and I decide on my own without any inputs. That would be a pretty fearful sort of imagery, right? So what we need is certainly government to do things on behalf of the people, but with checks and balances, so that there's some check that what they do is in the interests of the people. And that is where we have a liberal society with civil society. We have the judiciary. We have the political opposition, all of which attempt to keep the government in check and balance. And so now, what about Indian unicorns? That was the last question. Do these prices make any sense?
Yeah.
Well, broadly, I think you could ask, do the prices of any stock market in the world make sense? Obviously, there are areas of froth. A lot of people think the unicorns, are a good way to get into the economy of one of the last remaining. I mean, China is already well colonized as far as tech goes. And India, you're seeing some of the entities that are targeting the mass market come out. And so people think this is a way to get in. Are those prices reasonable? I don't know. I mean, compare them to the prices of cryptocurrencies. You have a hard time trying to figure out which one is more reasonable. But broadly speaking, I would say I'd far rather that the market decide and make mistakes. Perhaps investors decide, and I wouldn't say small investors should put a lot of their money in very risky assets like these, but far rather that they decide than the government decide what's good for the investor and what's not. I think governments tend to make big mistakes.
Absolutely, spot on. Well, we come to the end of a very, very stimulating 1 hour conversation. Thank you very much, Professor Raghuram Rajan, for being so candid and so forthcoming on such a range of subjects. I just want to quickly end with some of the key points, so just 2 or 3 of the very critical points that I picked up. The first point that Professor Rajan made with such force was that he wished the entire pandemic, there was a much greater sense of global leadership that would have harnessed energies all across the world, would have ensured much higher levels of vaccine production, would have ensured that we don't atomize things like vaccine passports into narrow geographies. So the need for much greater global leadership, and that could have stimulated a much greater, much more vigorous response. We hope that the time has come now that we have a breathing respite from the severity of the pandemic, that leadership will now emerge. So that's a wish. He also talked about the thing that really keeps him up at night, and which is the fact that there is a whole generation which could be uneducated. I use uneducated in a different sense from illiteracy. That there could be children who will go back to school, who may not get the level of schooling required for them to make up for what they've missed out. And that could be 50, 60 years of a handicap that countries like ours will find very severely difficult to overcome. So a real focus needed, a real energetic focus needed on addressing that problem. And of course, collateral with that was the need for a safety net for the informal sector. While formalization of the economy is good, there are times like these which are abnormal times, and it's important that there is a safety net, that the informal sector is in a sense protected and nurtured and nourished to survive the pandemic rather than die and leave the field open for the big corporate sector. These were the 2 or 3 points that I thought were made very forcefully and extremely relevant. Once again, thank you very much to Professor Raghuram Rajan, and thank you very much to our audience for being with us this evening. So I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Thank you, Raghav. That was wonderful of you also. Thank you.